So I was asked today and have the pleasure of talking to you very briefly about the cancer data ecosystem, providing a very short and quick overview of that, which is funded under the Cancer Moonshot activities. Next slide, please. So the National Cancer Data Ecosystem is really a consolidation of a number of different activities that integrate data from basic research all the way through clinical care as well as surveillance. And as you can see, there are a great number of different organizations and entities that are participating and involved in the cancer data ecosystem. Next slide, please. So the overall goal is really to enable everyone across the cancer research and care continuum to be able to access, contribute, and bring in their data that will support new discoveries and lead to lowering, of course, the burden of cancer, which is the goal of the NCI. We're proposing to do this through accelerating progress, including for prevention and screening, encouraging greater cooperation and collaboration, which will relate to some of the things I'm going to mention in a moment, and then, of course, to enhance data sharing, which is, I think, very important and related to what Dr. Malin is going to talk about in just a few moments. Next slide. So there are two major areas. The first is the Cancer Research Data Commons, and there are three components of that. Really, the first is to enable and support common authentication and authorization. The second is data nodes, which are data stored in domain or program-specific repositories. And the third is the fact that researchers can bring their own data and tools into the cloud and to combine those data with data that are existing in the CRDC. Next slide, please. The two areas that I've been most involved in are really about infrastructure and really relate to privacy, which again is what Dr. Malin is going to talk about. And the first of these is the P3RL, which is a set of activities that we have that are assessing commercial applications that permit privacy-preserving and tokenized linkages. The second is de-identification of narrative text clinical documents. And as you are well aware, I'm sure, it's critical because most information that we're interested in medical records exists in unstructured text documents. And there's limited de-identified data that's able to be shared across the network to develop NLP or deep learning tools against these data. Next slide. I think that is it. And so really with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Justin Ginay from Sage Bionetworks, who leads the data coordinating centers for the NCI-funded Cancer Systems Biology Consortium and the Human Tumor Atlas Network. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Lynn. So it's my pleasure to moderate this session and to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Brad Malin, who will be presenting on data privacy. This presentation, it turns out, is particularly well timed as today is Data Privacy Day. This is a yearly event to promote privacy and data protection best practices, which is now in its 14th year. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when I went to Google's webpage, they had not modified it to celebrate this important topic. So Dr. Malin is Vice Chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Vanderbilt University Medical Center and the Accenture Professor of Biomedical Informatics, Biostatistics, and Computer Science at Vanderbilt University. He co-founded and co-directs the Center for Genetic Privacy and Identity in Community Settings, and the NIH Center of Excellence in Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications Research. He has founded and co-directs the Vanderbilt Center for Health Data Science. Brad has developed numerous technologies to support privacy in large research programs, including the Electronic Medical Records and Genomics eMERGE Network and the All of Us Research Program. He's an appointed member of the European Medicines Agency Advisory Committee to disseminate clinical trials data to the public. Among his various honors, he's a recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for scientists and engineers from the White House and is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. Brad completed his education at Carnegie Mellon University, where he received a bachelor's in biological sciences, a master's in machine learning, a master's in public policy and management, and a doctorate in computer science. So without further ado, Brad.
Okay, thanks, Justin, and thanks, Lynn. So I'm going to begin by saying I'm not an oncologist. I am not specifically a cancer researcher, but I work on the development of infrastructure to facilitate data sharing and create new paradigms of research. So I'm going to give you a little bit of taste of what privacy is in this context, why it matters, and how it can actually facilitate things. Let's start by talking about all of us. I believe a lot of the people who are sitting in this seminar are already familiar with all of us, but just to give you a little context, all of us was established a number of years ago to create infrastructure for collecting data on about 1 million individuals in the US, mainly including electronic medical records data, as well as participant contributed information from surveys, and a number of biospecimens that would be made accessible for research purposes. So this was a program that we began, Vanderbilt in concert with a number of our partners, both in academia and in the corporate domain, including Verily, started supporting a couple of years ago and creating the infrastructure to make this data accessible. And one of the first things that we had to ask was, how are we actually going to protect the privacy of the individuals within this program? One of the first things we started doing was creating a public resource that was fully accessible, that didn't require any additional attestation of who an individual was in order to get access. And so as of October last year, we began sharing data on about 300,000 participants within the program, covering over 24,000 conditions and over 27,000 drug exposures. And as the COVID-19 pandemic continued to expand its reach, we began a program that was collecting information about individuals' mental health as well as physical status with respect to the virus. And we began sharing aggregated information. This is a summary of some of the conditions that you would come across within this resource if you took a look at it as of this morning. And you see that this is an all-comers environment. We're really trying to capture information in a natural setting. So we're picking up everything from just general pain assessments to the rate at which people are being diagnosed with hypertension and other comorbidities that are relatively chronic in nature. But we're also picking up cancer. And this is just a quick search that you can do to take a look at the different types of cancer that individuals are having reported within their EMR, as well as what they're telling us that they've been diagnosed with. You can see that general neoplastic disease ends up being the most prevalent from what we've seen so far, but there's a decent amount of skin cancer and breast cancer within the resource as well. That's an illustration of just to whet your appetite of the type of infrastructure, the type of data that we're starting to talk about here. And this is an illustration of what's happening in the US. But as Justin pointed out earlier, I've also been the last couple of years working with the European Medicines Agency. And the main reason is because a couple of years ago, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago now, they began this initiative for clinical trials transparency. And specifically under what they've called Policy 70. The goal is to disseminate clinical trials data for any clinical trial that passes through Europe. And this includes data for individuals who weren't necessarily European residents. They just were part of the trial. The goal was to, in phase 1, have the clinical study reports made publicly accessible. And then at a later point in time, and they're working towards this, making individual level records available as well. If you're interested in it, you can go to this website. This gives you an illustration of all of the studies that have had information contributed to the resource already. And that's kind of building on another program that started about a decade ago called Project Datasphere, that I was also involved when it got up and off the ground. And Project Datasphere was mainly started as an environment to share the results of oncological clinical studies. particularly there was an interest in sharing information on failed phase 3 studies. And what could you do with this data? And one of the first things, as this information was brought forth, and we were doing so in a de-identified manner, there was a challenge that was issued by DREAM to investigate what could you do from the perspective of prostate cancer. And so a whole series of investigations were started with analyzing data across the studies, particularly from the control arms of these studies, to look at the natural etiology of prostate cancer as well as other indications. And so this was, what you're seeing here is the first paper that came out on the reuse of the data from these trials. But then there were a whole series of other papers that were published on various topics. Some of them were specifically focused on particular aspects of cancer. Others were focused on, and most recently focused on, methodological developments, trying to figure out how best to design control groups for reuse across trials. Now, the question as we were doing this, and has always been the question, is what could go wrong? And what are we afraid of when trying to collect and share data? And I'd like to begin with a cautionary tale. I've always referred to this as the face that launched 1,000 ships, because it really set the stage for why people are concerned about identifiability issues. And it begins with this guy. And if you're not familiar with him, some of you may be, this is Bill Weld. He was the governor of the state of Massachusetts, and during the 2016 election, he was actually running as a vice presidential candidate. But this is the face that really got people interested and concerned about the problem. It's known as what I refer to as the quasi-identifier conundrum. And what happened and why this problem became prevalent and in the mind's eye was that before regulation like HIPAA came out, there was a number of initiatives that were focused on collecting and sharing data in general. At the time when Bill Clinton was president, there was an initiative that Hillary Clinton began with Newt Gingrich and others that was really trying to understand comparative effectiveness. Why is it that certain types of problems cost a substantially more amount of money to treat at certain institutions than other institutions? And why were the outcomes different? And so they created this panel that went around to all the various states and said, what type of data do you need in order to do this type of comparative effectiveness research? And this was the type of information that you see listed here, where there was interest in diagnoses and procedures that were performed and costs, but also the general demographics of the individuals. And this began our hospital discharge database program in the US. And by the end of the 90s, we were seeing, I believe, on the order of 45 out of 50 US states were collecting and sharing this information for a relatively nominal fee. Now, the reason why I bring up the governor is because at the same time, he was receiving an honorary doctorate and he ended up collapsing while he was on stage, and nobody knew what happened. And an enterprising young MIT graduate student, LaTanya Sweeney, recognized that his information was going to show up in these discharge databases. Now, they knew he had been sent to Massachusetts General Hospital. They knew the approximate time at which this happened. And notably, they knew that he was a resident of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so she went and took a copy of the state of Massachusetts hospital discharge data. And then she went off and she purchased the voter registration list for the city of Cambridge, and then just cross-referenced the two of them. And in doing so, illustrated that he was the only person who was living in his 5-digit zip code with his birth date and his gender, and was admitted to MGH during that time. And this kind of freaked people out because it illustrated that it wouldn't take that much information to uniquely represent someone and get back to their identity. There were questions about whether or not this was a one-off type of situation or if it was generalizable. And so there were a series of investigations that just completely set the world on fire, illustrating that not only was this replicable within demographics, but it expanded to many other types of information. And so if you take a look at the literature, you'll find that there are numerous investigations in the US and abroad looking at how simple demographics identify people. The current estimates are somewhere between 50 to 85% of the US population alone is unique on the factors that were used to identify well. But then it expanded beyond demographics, looking at diagnosis codes and rare diseases, considering environmental measures that are used in various types of studies, health survey responses, laboratory tests. A whole host of investigations have been conducted into DNA, as well as pedigree structures and RNA and the proteome. And this is just what happens within the healthcare domain. You move beyond that realm, and you'll see that in other types of environments, this uniqueness phenomenon comes into play. The reason why this has become really of concern today is because of the fact that we're starting to combine a lot of the information we're collected in the healthcare domain with not just social determinants of health, but information that comes out of other types of brokered environments, ranging from how people are using their credit cards and what types of information they're purchasing and what types of things they're purchasing in grocery stores. It's also the fact that self-disclosure is not helping the matter. And so this was some research that we had done relatively recently, a couple years ago, looking at what happens when people get excited about communicating that they're members of a program. And so we had developed a very simple web crawler as well as a machine learned classifier to just find tweets to see if people were saying what programs are they a part of. Without an exhaustive search, we ended up finding over 100 people from 20 large cohort studies that were disclosing their participation. As an example, this was in a much older tweet where somebody said that they were excited to become part of a program a number of years ago that had over 500,000 participants, and they do so because they're proud of being a participant. But in doing so, they actually put themselves at risk. They're not necessarily disclosing what would be their health problems or any other aspect about themselves, but they are disclosing that they're a member of this population, this subpopulation, which makes them easier to identify. So this is one of the challenges with modern social media. And just to give you an illustration of how these attacks can run beyond demographics, I'll give an illustration of a paper we published a number of years ago where we showed how diagnosis codes could end up leading to identification of information that wasn't necessarily collected in the clinical domain. We began this investigation because we were looking at biorepositories that were being appended onto electronic medical record systems for research purposes. And what we illustrated was that if you had information in an identified EMR, somebody knew some information, diagnostic information about someone, that the simple combination of the ICD codes, either at a level of version 9 or version 10 now, it didn't take many of them in combination to uniquely represent somebody, and thus you would be able to link over towards the genomic record. So this wasn't even a re-identification through genomics. This was just using the general clinical information. And what we had found using about 2 million EMRs from Vanderbilt, that we could get down to a unique representation of individuals, of our patients within about a year's worth of data from them. So this is just how you could go about instituting this attack in other domains. I don't think I have to really mention the fact that it does not take much in terms of high dimensional omics data to uniquely represent somebody as well. What you're seeing here is 500 SNPs, and this really is only going to correspond to one person if you have sufficient variation as you would come across in the general population. Now, what we've also seen is over the last decade or so an evolution of these types of attacks, in that they're now going beyond attacks on a single individual and moving towards populations, where it began with work that David Craig's group at TGen with one of his scientists, Niels Homer, instituted as a really interesting phenomenon, where they did not begin as privacy researchers. They actually were beginning an investigation into how to determine if somebody was in like a mass grave, determine if somebody was a member of a pooled sample. And what they showed was that the types of aggregate statistics on cohorts that were having data that would be publicly disseminated through resources such as the database of genotypes and phenotypes, this could put people at risk for identification purposes. And specifically, they said, so imagine you have a control group within a cohort, and let's say these people are in a diabetes study, and these are the people who lack diabetes. And what you're seeing here are the allelic frequencies within this population. And they said, so okay, so imagine that's public. And now we also see the same type of allelic frequencies for the case population as well. And what Craig noticed was that there were already public resources that gave some type of a background indication of what these frequencies would look like in general, as opposed to being in one of these specific studies. And you can notice that there's some differences here a little bit. And they said, so imagine that you have an adversary and they have some private knowledge, and they would be able to measure the similarity between if an individual, this assumes you know their DNA, but if you have their DNA, you'd be able to say, are you closer to being in one of these case or control populations than you are to the general background? And given sufficient closeness, you could then make a claim that they're a member of one of these groups. And when they brought this information over to the NIH and said, hey, we think this is a feasible attack, they were given several on the order of like 60, 70 cases to investigate. And they were able to illustrate in almost every single time that given this knowledge, they would correctly determine if somebody was in one of these particular groups, as opposed to being in just the general population. This kind of led to a bit of a knee-jerk reaction in that dbGaP pulled all of the summary statistics down offline. And this was an artifact of, it was trying to, the NIH was responding to a threat, but they responded in a manner such that all the information was pushed behind the firewall. Now, so this is an illustration of what you could do with aggregated information. Fast forward a couple years, and then similar types of attacks were run against other resources. A couple years ago, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health created the Beacon program, for instance, where somebody could issue a query to an organization to say, hey, I'm seeing this really interesting variant. I don't know much about it. I don't know if it's de novo. It would be really helpful if you could tell me if you have seen anybody like this before. And Carlos Bustamante's group over at Stanford then illustrated that given enough queries against a beacon, you would be able to determine if an individual was actually at a particular institution. You could determine them. You might be able to determine family members as well. A couple years later, Chris Lippert at Human Longevity, and this is Craig Ventnor's group, illustrated that under the right conditions, you might be able to infer even more interesting information, possibly even the facial structures of individuals. And I said this is under the right conditions, but it was really just a proof of concept. But it was showing how you would take that next leap to take genomic information and other information and potentially get back to phenomic information that would be physically observable in the real world. About a year and a half, two years ago, we had also the first case where genomic information in the public domain was used to find somebody who committed violent crimes. This was known as the Golden State Killer case, where there were serial killings all throughout the 1970s, where it turned into a cold case. But as a lot of people started taking their own genomes and putting them online through organizations like GED Match, the FBI came forward with all this cold case DNA and started putting it into the environment, into GED Match, and said, hey, are there matches out there? And they didn't find the person who would end up becoming the Golden State Killer, but they did find family members, people who were on the order of a couple cousins away. And then they could build the pedigree and then start asking questions about, hey, was there somebody living in California who was a little crazy that we might be able to do an investigation into? And this is how they ended up tracking down this one person. There's been a series of cold cases that have been instituted or have been actually solved using this strategy since then, particularly in partnership with groups like Parabon Labs. So this is the threat. This is the concern, which is that as the opportunity to share more data and collect more data about people grows, the chances that people are going to have their privacy infringed upon, for better or worse, is growing. And this is kind of where I get a little two-faced on you, though, because what I've really shown you is that there's a possibility for a problem to occur. And under the right circumstances, there really can be real world implications. But at the same time, these cases, I won't call them one-offs, but they're special instances. And they're instances in which there is a sufficient motivation that's at the table, where people either have enough time on their hands, or they can institute enough effort, or they have sufficient money behind them, an incentive to actually run an attack for whatever purpose they're trying to use it for. Now, I will argue that that case, or the conditions under which that will happen, is somewhat motivated by an economic framework, in that there's a payout that people get from doing this. Now, in order to understand how that gets applied and why this matters, we need to take a step back and think about how regulations allow for data to be collected and reused. Like, how did we put ourselves in this situation now, and under what conditions as a society have we decided that this is what we're going to do? Because the methods that we've designed and have developed over the years are very much risk-oriented. And you have to understand how you go about measuring risk in order to determine when data sharing is permissible. So let me give a couple of definitions to set the stage here. I'll begin with the notion of what's a human subject, at least in a regulatory stance. And if you look at the common rule, what the common rule says is it has a definition of identifiable private information. And it basically states that this is information for which you have the identity of a human subject. And that identity can be readily ascertained by the investigator or the associated information. And now you have to ask, well, so what's a human subject? And a human subject is anybody who's a living individual with whom the investigator is conducting research, has obtained information through intervention or interaction with them, or uses or studies that information, or they've obtained or generated identifiable private information. Okay, so this is a really interesting definition, because now you have to take a step back and say, well, what is identifiable? What is that? What does that actually mean? And the common rule doesn't really come out to tell you this. And so it kind of creates a fuzzy gray space. Now, so that's what happens with the notion of human subjects, but a lot of you may actually be familiar with a different definition of personal information or identifiability, and that comes out of HIPAA. And HIPAA doesn't use the notion of a human subject. It uses the notion of de-identification, of personal identity. And right, so the common rule will dictate the world when we're talking about the research domain, but HIPAA comes into play when we're talking about healthcare and data derived from EMRs. And so according to HIPAA, it says that it only applies to individually identifiable health information, and that when the information doesn't identify someone, and there's no reasonable basis, which is a wonderful legal term, to believe that you could identify someone. When that doesn't happen, then HIPAA no longer plays a role. It says the data is sufficiently de-identified. Now, that's an interesting definition, but then HIPAA took it a step further and said, hey, we're going to give you implementation guidelines here. So how do you meet the definition of de-identification? And it said, well, one option is to do what people refer to as safe harbor. And in this, it says, go remove 18 types of identifiers. And furthermore, attest to the fact that you have no actual knowledge that the residual information can identify someone. It turns out that, so this is really the dumb cookbook approach to this. And it's not really what the federal government had laid on the table initially. Initially, they took the perspective that you should go do something that's a risk assessment and go assess from the perspective of statistical methodology or scientific principles to show that you have very small risk that given an anticipated recipient, they would have sufficient ability to identify someone. And I personally, I love this definition. It's what guides a lot of our research because it indicates that you can create a model. And then given that model, you can optimize the type of information that you're willing to disclose given these assumptions, right? And you do definitely have to have some clear idea of what those assumptions are going to be. And so sometimes you'll end up being more conservative as an artifact, but it gives you flexibility. The reason why I think this matters is if you go back to the attack on the Golden State Killers data, this was done by Yaniv Ehrlich, and there was this New York Times article where they're talking to Yaniv about what he had done, and CC Moore, who runs Parabon Labs, and they said, this is really interesting. This we think that this could be done with other records, but it's actually really interesting. They're like, why? It's really difficult to actually do this. You need to have a skilled expert who has the ability to construct this type of information and really have some intuition into pushing this forward. In other words, it's not simple, right? There's effort here. And it turns out that perspective, the scenario in which you're thinking about sharing data, really can influence the extent to which privacy is maintained. And so what we hear a lot about is how big data can end up killing privacy. And it turns out that under the right conditions, big data can actually enable what I call big privacy. And I'll give an illustration of how this is possible. So let's go back to the diagnosis linkage problem. Here's an example where we're going to be looking at genotype-phenotype associations, and specifically phenome-wide associations. And I'll readily admit that I stole this slide from Josh Denny a number of years ago, and I will continue to do so. But you'll notice that, so with PheWAS, we're looking across all of the electronic medical record system, and we're looking at associations with a particular genomic variant. And we're looking at everything from digestive disorders to neoplasms that are documented in the EMR. And we're trying to get this data out the door. And so what we looked at was what happens if we suppress diagnoses that have a small number of patients, just as an illustration, if this is our concern, if this is our threat model. So we removed diagnoses that had less than 5 patients associated with. So basically triaging the long tail of this population. And we're looking to see how well we can validate 192 genome-phenome associations. And so what you're going to see is on the x-axis, you'll see the original p-values for these associations, and the y-axis will be the p-values after we've protected the data. And so we initially said, so here's a cohort of 5,000 people. This was a group that was initially used in a study that Josh and Marilyn Ritchie had run. And so you can see there's a decent amount of variability here in terms of where the original statistical significance was and where the resulting statistical significance was. There's still a positive correlation between the two of them, but it wasn't that strong. And this made an assumption that the attacker would know that somebody was a member of the cohort. This was a situation in which if somebody had self-disclosed that they were a member of the study, this was the type of risk that we would end up having to deal with and the resulting utility that we would get out of the data. However, what happens if they don't self-disclose? What happens if we don't know if somebody's a member of that cohort? And instead, we can assume that they're a member of, say, 1.5 million patient records that would be accessible and available for such a study. Turns out that the amount of suppression that you need to institute is substantially smaller. And this is intuitive. This makes sense, right? You're growing the population, you're holding the number of variables relatively constant. And so you have a greater likelihood that you're going to generate people who look like you or look like another record. And so the correlation between the original system and the protected system ended up being not perfect, but really good, to the point where we were feeling really good about this methodology that says, look, this is why adversarial modeling matters. So let's take this a step further and start thinking about risk, because that's thinking about capabilities of people and what knowledge they hold. Now, when people are doing risk assessments for sharing data for whatever purpose it is, typically what they think about are several principles. And if any of these principles fail, it means that the data may actually be okay to share as it is. But first, you're going to look at the extent to which the information is replicable in multiple resources. Because if it's not replicable, then it's almost impossible to identify someone because it's just not stable. Secondly, you have to ask who has access to this information, because the information may be sensitive and it may be distinguishing, but if it only ever shows up in an environment where there are trusted managers of that information, say like within the medical center, nobody else sees it, then it's not really going to be useful for identification purposes. And then you have to ask the question of, if you make it through those two gates, how unique or how distinguishing is this information going to be for a particular record? And this is how we think about the probability of re-identification. But I argue that is really only one piece of the puzzle, because what that's saying is, what's the probability of privacy compromise given that somebody actually instituted the attack and felt comfortable instituting that attack? What's notable about de-identified information is that there's no regulatory context for it. You're allowed to share that information without any oversight. Right? Now, the examples I showed you way earlier, we did have some additional contractual agreements in place, but that is really what you see here in terms of the first factor, which is that's the chance that somebody would even begin to mount this attack. So this is a whole different realm in terms of where information protection comes into play when performing these risk assessments. So not just is the data unique, but is somebody sufficiently motivated, capable of even exploiting the environment? So what are they agreeing to within the use agreements? And if they violate the use agreement, is there specification for liquidated damages that you can hold them accountable for? Under what conditions do you get to observe what they're doing? Do you get to audit how they use the information? Now, you may not always be able to determine if they're misusing the information per se, but in the event that they did, you would have a record of their use. More so, just having those eyes on you has the ability to steer people back towards using the information in a manner that is going to be more benevolent than malevolent. Now, there's a long history of different data privacy mechanisms that can be used to protect information. And some people talk about things like k-anonymity, where you make people look similar to k-1 other records. Most recently, people have moved into things like differential privacy, which are statistical perturbation techniques. I can go through all of these. I don't want to. And the main reason is because I think a lot of what this is just different ways of manipulating the data. And really what we're thinking about in our work is saying that, think of this more strategically. There's a holder of the data. There's an originator of that information, whether it be Vanderbilt or whether it be the NIH through all of us. And then there's be a potential requester for the information. And that requester may be somebody who has the best interests at heart for the individuals to whom the data corresponds, but it might also be somebody who's not. And given what you know about this environment, you can begin to model their incentive structures, both on the sharing as well as on the use. And given those incentive structures, you can think about the strategies that people can play out for collecting and misusing or using this data. And then given that, you can turn this into a procedural relationship. Now, what does that mean? And how do you use it? Let me give an example. So with all of us, what I showed you before was the public domain. So you can get there without logging into the system. It's summary statistics only. But what we've recently released out into the world are the new sandbox environments. And in the sandbox environments, we are in the midst of creating two. One is what's called the registered tier and what that's called the controlled tier. And the registered tier, which has our most recent release, the data I showed you earlier from the October 2020, this is available to anyone within a trusted organization who's entering into a relationship with the NIH and with the program. And we're vetting the users of the data by seeing whether or not they have an NIH ERA Commons ID. And so there's accountability here. It's not just entering into a use agreement with the user. It's also ensuring that they have somebody on top of them who's leveraging or putting pressure on them to be good Samaritans with respect to the resource as well. And so they have a dog in the show, so to speak. And so it's at this level, at the registered tier, that we're giving individual level data with a low risk of re-identification. We've actually gone above and beyond what would be considered safe harbor because we're sharing data on a level that we don't believe has ever been shared before. And we want to be a little cautious at the outset. But we're still giving a lot of the EMR information and the survey information out in this level. Where we're going is in a couple months, we're going to be releasing the controlled section of the AOU program. And again, this is also going to be trusted investigators, but we're going to be putting out the genomic information as it comes out the door. We're going to be providing much more details about the demographics of these individuals. And so there's a tension here in that we're going to be expanding the user base with respect to the registered tier as we can to try to allow citizen scientists and other groups to come in who are non-traditional researchers. Right now, we're cutting our teeth on making sure that registered is working for the standard researcher community. So we've expanded a little bit. But then as we get comfortable with that, we'll be expanding and then moving those people into the controlled tier. Okay, so this is a trade-off between data detail, potential for risk, and trust in the researcher community. Similar things have happened with the European Medicines Agency's initiative. So what they've done is they've become a little less heavy-handed than what all of us have done, and that as you go to request information, and I'll walk you through this, they take you to a terms of use, and eventually it turns into a click-through agreement, and that click-through agreement is going to say, you're going to agree to not attempt to re-identify anyone. Now, can you guarantee they're going to be a good Samaritan? No. Are they going to have something that is legally binding in this regard? Quite possibly, but it has yet to be tested. Okay, so let's come back to this situation that I told you about where we had this re-identification concern, the one that kind of drove everything from the outset. Now, one thing I'll note is that this attack took place before HIPAA and its privacy rule was ever on the table. Turns out that if this type of an attack was run again, this data was covered by HIPAA, it would not be considered de-identified information. There's a lot of information within here that the federal government has already said this is unacceptable. Now, more interestingly, from our perspective and adversarial modeling, we took a look at the ways in which various organizations who were sharing data in the eMERGE network would be susceptible to this type of an attack. And so we really did poll all of the electoral commissions in a number of states to try to understand what type of information was accessible. And so what you can see here is that in states like Illinois, the amount of information that you'd like to use for identification purposes can get really detailed. And it will cost you on the order of like $500 to get access to that voter registration list. Whereas if you were to try and identify somebody in Wisconsin and use the voter list, you would end up having a much more tricky situation because all the naughty bits that you're interested in using for identification purposes aren't there. And the total amount of cost that you're going to be paying for the data is several orders of magnitude higher than where you were for Illinois. So this is why we start to think about this problem from an economic sense. And we moved into the world of game theory. And specifically, we started thinking about these problems as two-party games, or what are known as leader-follower games, or stackable games, where you have a sharing strategy. And this sharing strategy will have a certain payout to the publisher, and there's a utility associated with that payout. And there is a risk, but we don't know what the risk is because we don't know exactly what the recipient could do. Now, all of our strategies could be, we're going to hold back certain portions of the genome, or we could generalize the demographics, or we could charge for access to the data, all different ways in which we can deter the users from misusing the information. Now, at the same time, since we haven't published the data yet, we can look at what a recipient might have the capability to do. And they might have different strategies at their disposal, each of which will give them some benefit or some utility, but will induce some risk for us. And we can enumerate all of these strategies, and then we can figure out which is their best strategy and use that to populate the risk for one of our own strategies, for the one that guided them. And we can play this out for every possible way in which we might share data. And then there might be a different strategy from the attacker's perspective that induces risk. Regardless, we get to the end of this process, we can then choose the best strategy that best balances the risk-utility trade-off for the publisher. So how does this work? How does this play out? Here, I'm going to give you an example of how this has worked with demographics, and then I think I'm going to run out of time, so I'll skip another example. The illustration of this, or how we've done this with general demographics, is we played out a scenario where we worked with data from the US Census Bureau, and we took 30,000 census records, and we looked at the average payoff per record that an adversary would get. And the numbers, we said, imagine it's $1,200 as a benefit per record, $300 as a cost per violation, and $4 as an access cost per record. This was calibrated based on real data. $4 is about how much you pay an information broker like in Intellius.com to get access to data. $300 would be the cost per violation. And in our expectation, we based that $300 on the amount of money that healthcare organizations were paying as artifacts of breaches to their EMR systems. So this was based on the wall of shame data that the Office for Civil Rights has published. And the $1,200 was actually based on the average amount of dollars that members of the eMERGE network were being paid through grant dollars from the NIH, because if it turns out that if you're going to put yourself at more risk, then the data is actually going to be worth at the end of the day. It may actually be in your interest to not take that grant. So if you're not familiar with information brokers like Intellius, I would strongly encourage you to go check yourself out. This is the type of information that is made available for a number of reasons. I won't go through all the details, but this is out there and it's cheap. So we played several different games, and one is what we refer to as the safe harbor game, where you defend under that strategy, under that policy. One is where we let the Stackelberg game play out completely. This is the basic game. We then said, well, not all institutional review boards are comfortable with us turning privacy into a game and letting it play out. So let's imagine that the maximum amount you could share would be under safe harbor. And we call that safe harbor friendly. And then we also, we encountered a really interesting phenomenon where there's a potential for adversaries to come in and exploit the system, but they choose not to do so because the payout to them would end up being negative. They're sufficiently deterred. And we call this the no attack scenario. Okay, so let's just see how this plays out. This is my typical my line is better than your line graph. This is where safe harbor plays out, where you can see there's some risk that an attacker might be successful, might get a payout from this as an artifact, but the publisher will get way more payout than them. And so they'll play this game. This is where we end up with, if we end up, yeah, Justin.
Sorry, Derek, just a 8-minute time check.
I'll be done in 1 minute.
Perfect. Thanks.
And so this is the point at which the game theoretic framework would tell you should share the data because it maximizes the total overall benefit. Publisher gets more, attacker gets a little bit more as an artifact. Safe harbor friendly. Turns out you can actually get a lot of benefit without losing a lot when trying to optimize the system. And then in the no attack scenario, we're not quite as good in the payout as the full Stackelberg game, but this is way more payout. This is way more detail in the data than we would have been able to get otherwise. And there's no payout to the attacker, assuming we've modeled them correctly. This is the type of structure. This is the type of scenario that we advocate for now. I'll skip what we've done within eMERGE, and I will jump to the very end. 2 slides here. One is what you've seen so far is this is de-identification. This is adversarial modeling. This all falls under the guise of risk management when publishing data. There's a whole bunch of other research that's going in the direction, as Lynn said before, with privacy preserving record linkage, as well as how do you do secure outsourced computation and secure computation more generally, as well as synthetic data generation. These are all new types of privacy protection mechanisms that have applicability in various settings that we're not going to get to today. So what should we worry about? And let me bring this home. The number and diversity of investigators is going to continue to grow, which is a concern. The data will continue to get more detailed and complex. I think that risk analysis is going to help, but we need to figure out what society acceptable levels of risk are going to be and will continue to be. And I've already said this. I think finally, one point should be made clear. There is a good chance that breaches will happen at some point with some information, and we shouldn't be surprised by this. We need to be prepared to acknowledge them and have some type of a response prepared when that happens. Okay, so I'll just acknowledge there are a lot of people who have worked on this over the years, and I'll thank AOU and I'll thank eMERGE for letting us put this out into real world practice.
Thank you, Brad. That was an excellent presentation. We do have a few questions. I'd like to start with one of my own. On the one hand, it seems like there's a lot of exciting developments in technology and governance structures. You mentioned a few at the end, secure multi-party protection, federated queries, data enclaves, honest brokers, synthetic data. And there's a lot of interesting developments. On the other hand, you talked about adversarial attacks, data breaches, and obviously the concern of litigation around all of these. I guess my general question is, how sanguine are you about the general way in which the research community is approaching these topics, and whether we're actually moving in the right direction with respect to enabling biomedical research while still protecting data privacy, or are we kind of moving in the wrong direction?
I'd say there's a lot of what's being done right now in multi-party computation or secure computation in general, and where this is heading, is useful from the perspective of basic science. We can't even consider putting these technologies out into practice until we know what they're capable of. So you want to see them develop, you want to see them advocated for, but then you have to think about what the benefit cost trade-off is here. Because in the context of like secure computation, and we've developed some of these methods, they're really great in terms of giving you like they compute a function for you, and they will tell you whether or not, like, what these regression coefficients are. Great. What people get concerned about is they can't inspect the original information. And so if you have data inaccuracies, or there's just something that you don't necessarily agree with in the data, you're kind of stuck hoping that whoever was the supplier of the data took care of them, or could give some intuition into what happened. And that's a hard thing for people to swallow, I think. A lot of investigators like to scratch, sniff, and touch the data. And I don't know if we've really gotten to the point where people are willing to give up that control yet. That will be a bit of a scientific paradigm shift, and it will take time to get there. So I don't think that the methods are misdirected. I think that they just don't always know under what conditions they're going to be applicable yet.
Great, thanks. So we have a question, which I will do my best to paraphrase. This is really about issues around consent and the legal challenges that might happen over time, particularly around how do you convey the potential future risks to patients and individuals.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I think it depends on under what conditions you're obligated to do so. And so I think this is where we get into the schism between ethics and law, of which I'm neither an ethicist nor a lawyer. But the schism goes as follows. If we're talking about identifiability, in that situation, there ends up becoming a legal capability such that you're not requesting their consent for participation or reuse of their information. Now, large programs like All of Us, research programs, have gone the consent route. And I advocate for consent because I think it's beneficial to have people on board. I also worry at the same time that consent can potentially get in the way of having a more complete view on a population. And there are lots of groups that may be hesitant to consent. There is then the question of the ethical component, which is what ought you to do. And that I think still requires discussion, because at the present moment in time, until I think there's a forcing function that says we should consent people, we have to consent people, I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis. And now if you have to communicate risk to them, that's a much more tricky situation. The biggest problem is that we really don't have a lot of cases of people being identified from studies yet. And until that happens, and I hope it doesn't happen, it's very challenging to give some indication of what the real risks are. We can pose them as potential risks, but we really don't have them calibrated very well.
Great. We have 1 minute left. Maybe we can just touch on one question here around blockchain. Any comments about how it could be used in the context of privacy?
Oh, I mean, I can opine on anything. Blockchain is an interesting phenomenon. Blockchain, unfortunately, doesn't stop privacy problems or security intrusions. It is really useful from the perspective of provenance. It gives you an indication of who has seen the data, maybe who has had the rights to access it. But blockchain in its own right doesn't really prevent people from working with the information. So it's nice in terms of it gives you a lineage, but it really is going to be way more applicable in the context of environments where you have a limited good that needs to be transferred from one person to another, right? That's really what blockchain was designed for. It was transference of things as opposed to just protecting the overall system. So if I had $1 and I wanted to pay you $1, I could document that I gave it to you. Or if I owned the data and then I wanted to then give the data over to you, I would have to relinquish it and then bring it back. Using blockchain to really try and say, manage the overall ecosystem. I don't think, for instance, for research domains, that in terms of privacy protection, blockchain really helps us at all. Doesn't mean it's not a useful technology. It's something that could wrap around and it can give us documentation and provenance about what's been happening in the system, which might be useful if something went wrong and you needed to investigate who did something. However, you will always run into the digital to analog to digital problem, which is that just because somebody wasn't listed on the blockchain didn't mean they didn't see the data or wasn't provided with information off the chain, right? And that's why it's good for a transference of goods, because it can't move them off the chain. But data, it's in this situation, it's not a monetary good, so you can't do that. Big limitation there.
All right, we're out of time, so thank you, Brad, for an excellent presentation of the topic we all care very much about. Thank you.
Thanks. This was fun.